Hello and welcome back to the Stronghold. The Magi here, and I do a lot of coverage every season with regards to the latest and greatest addition to Magic the Gathering right here on Arena. Every new set, we talk about a bunch of stuff. But today we are going to talk about the top 3 draft archetypes for us specifically as budget players. And frankly, I think this is the most important topic of every season because it is the most crucial thing in allowing us to leverage our limited resources as new free-to-play or budget players and get the most not only cards but playable decks added to our arsenal. But before we get into all that, just a quick reminder that the Stronghold is producing content for you across a number of platforms. And Patreon has recently introduced an option where you can follow our content there without the need for any financial commitment. So even if you aren't ready to support the Stronghold is better positioned to support you. So you never miss out on a thing. Now, what were we talking about? Oh yeah, right. Before we get into the details of this particular set, it's important to understand the evaluation process that goes into these archetypes. Because we, particularly as budget players, need to make sure that we're maximizing all of that marginal utility to get the very most out of our bang for our buck, so to speak. Way more important than it is for players that are not as budget-minded. So there are 3 main factors that I use to evaluate a limited archetype, and they're not presented here in any particular order. And in fact, depending upon your limited environment, these will shift in relative importance. But first, I'd like to talk about value, and that is a concept that we deal with a lot as free-to-play and budget players. Here, we are specifically talking about the ability of a limited archetype to convert itself into a constructed deck, because otherwise we've drafted a bunch of cards that we might never really play again. Next up, let's talk about the accessibility of a particular archetype. And within that, there's a couple of factors here, as you can see. The first consideration is the depth of the archetype. Is this supported by a broad depth of low rarity commons and uncommons that really make that archetype work? Or is it very dependent on just very select higher rarity cards, making it a little harder to pull off? Very often within a limited format, we start hearing about the very best deck or the very worst deck, and that affects the way people draft. So one of the issues that we need to be considering is the relative popularity of a deck. Is this going to be highly disputed within your draft pod where 3 or maybe even 4 players are trying to move towards that and making the cards that much harder to get? Or is this an archetype that people maybe aren't really giving enough justice to, or possibly even actively avoiding, making it wide open for that one player at the table to really take advantage of? And lastly is the issue of flexibility of the archetype. If things don't go to plan, and we all know sometimes that happens more often than we'd like to admit, how easily can we flex or pivot into another archetype or style? How well do those color choices interact with other combinations so that we can make those clutch shifts when we need to? The missing component here, of course, is performance. How well a particular archetype will do within the limited environment against the other cards in that pool and the other competing archetypes. Or to put it in simpler terms, will it win? While value oftentimes takes the front seat for us as a budget community, and winning is less important, the reality is there is a component here for winning If you are doing any sort of value draft or a token supported premium draft, really just one win makes drafting a better option than just buying packs. If you're outside of that value draft or token supported premium draft, really, again, you're looking at 2, maybe more like 2.5, depending upon where you are in the history of Arena, to make that endeavor more worthwhile than buying packs. So winning is an important component here and needs to be taken into account. In the end, all of these different factors and components come together, and I tend to sort the archetypes into 3 basic tiers. Of course, the top tier is the title of the video, Top 3 Archetypes. These are the ones that I feel like our budget community needs to be focused on for the various reasons that we have just covered. It is not necessarily the top 3 best performing archetypes overall. As we have explained, there are other factors that budget players need to be mindful of. On the other end of the spectrum, of course, we have the tier 3, the decks that I recommend that you pretty actively avoid because the majority of the time it's just not going to be very beneficial for you. That having been said, of course, on any given day, any given limited event, the colors might come together for you. You might get access to really bomb-tastic cards, and anything could be playable on any given day. The middle ground is what I lovingly refer to as the backup plans, things that are not necessarily one extreme or the other, but often make good fallback points when your tier 1 plans don't come together. Maybe a color dries up, maybe you open a bomb in pack 2 and you need to shift a little bit. Those backup plans can be exactly what saves a draft for you, as opposed to being all in on the top tier aspects. Sometimes it's better to shift into a backup plan and have an overall better performance. All right, so as is tradition, I want to start this conversation of the Lost Caverns of Ixalan limited archetypes with what I recommend you avoid. And this ugly set of decks is really the story of black mana within this limited environment. And not because black is a bad color, but quite the opposite. It is in fact a victim of its own success. Black arguably has the best collection of commons and uncommons available to it of any other color. And as such, I think we need to avoid it altogether. You see, when you have a draft pod of 8 people going on, if 1 or 2 people are going after a particular archetype, it works out fine. But once you get a 3rd, 4th, or heaven forbid, a 5th person trying to go after the same 2-color archetype, well, they all fail miserably, and black is going to be so sought after that I would hate to see that happen to any of you out there by going after these black-driven archetypes. Another word on the Caves deck. In Limited, I just don't think this is very viable. It's going to be harder to pull off than a Band-Aid from a toddler. I do think Caves is going to be an interesting and possibly good budget constructed deck, but I just don't think it's worth going after in the limited environment. You're going to get these cards in your collection. You're going to get the black cards in your collection. We're just not going to worry about actively drafting those. And now, of course, I'd like to flip the script here a little bit and talk about the 3 archetypes that I do think we need to actively go after. And just like the ugly decks were the story of black, this is the story of red. Red has some really solid cards, but is not going to be so heavily sought after that it is going to be regrettable for us as budget players. All of these decks are synergizing with red. They're getting generally above average win rates. just really, really solid. I think the most likely new deck that we're going to be creating here is going to be that Gruul Dinosaur red-green deck. I think really and truly every single budget player out there should be looking to add this to their arsenal. The Boros, I'd tap that as is my working title. That actually might not so much create a new deck, although it might. But at the very least, I think it's going to put our existing red-white starter deck to a little better use, making some of those equipments useful in additional ways. And then we've got the what I call the loot deck. A lot of people are calling this pirates, but it's not really a pirate deck. It's an artifacts matter deck. And I think this is one of those that has an above average potential to be a useful deck. I think all of these have an above average potential to be included in next year's starter deck collection, but I wouldn't necessarily in these cases allow that to dissuade you from adding it to your arsenal now. And that, of course, leaves us with the 3 decks that didn't make either list, and we're going to talk for a moment about why they didn't. First up with Simic Explore, this one to me just lacks the synergy to really give it a winning tradition in Limited. It might not necessarily be hard to draft, but I just don't think it's going to be very easy to get wins on that unless you get a very exceptional draft experience, which of course, as budget value drafters, we can't always count on. Now, don't get me wrong, I do think Simic Merfolk might have a future as a constructed deck, but not necessarily based on the Explore mechanic like we see here in this limited environment. When we talk about green-white in this set, it really is about +1 matters, and as such it won't really add a new deck to your arsenal, but rather allow you to modify your existing Be My +1 deck in some new directions, pick up some potentially new cards, better cards, things of that sort. With the Azorius, what I would refer to as a craft deck, this one might be the best archetype competitively in the early format, and as such it's going to be very highly sought after. It's going to be tough to get the key cards that set blue-white as a distinct archetype up and make it distinctive from other blue or white decks. As such, there's a high chance that that draft experience is not going to go your way. I also think of all of these archetypes, this is the one most likely to carry over into next year's starters. So if you don't get it now, you will get it eventually. Oh, and you may notice if you were to take the good decks that we talked about a moment ago and remove the red and remix those 3 colors, you get these 3 archetypes. The concept being that these become easy fallback points if for some reason red dries up on you. You can easily jump to one of these other archetypes or possibly have options on 2 of them. All right, so now that we have some goals for this draft environment, how do we leverage that into a functional plan that has measurable and attainable steps? Well, the answer is, since we spend a lot of our early picks securing rares and mythics for our collection, and we really don't draft commons until much later in the pack when more valuable options are no longer available, we really need to pour a lot of our focus into the uncommons. And let's take a few minutes and talk about those now. Well, since all of our good archetypes do contain red, red would be a logical place to start thinking about your uncommons, and particularly with uncommons like Geological Appraiser that adds 3.1% to win rates right now. That would seem like a very solid plan. The second best uncommon right now in red is Diamond Pickaxe with a little less than 1% added. And then, of course, there's a trifecta of good dinosaur cards like Dreadmore Ire, Belligerent Yearling, and the Scythe Raptor. And really, all of those have win rates less than 1% but greater than 0. There are, however, a number of red uncommons, particularly for the dinosaur deck, that may wheel back around and might be safe passes. Things like Triumphant Chomp, Rampaging Ceratops, and Saheeli's Lattice really fit best into that green-red dinosaur deck, and a lot of other decks are not going to be nearly as interested in those cards. All in all, I don't think red is where you need to spend your first uncommon picks. In fact, I think making blue a priority in those early uncommon picks is perhaps one of the biggest power moves you can make in this format. With cards like Zoetic Glyph at a 7.6 differential, Spyglass Siren sporting a 6.0, and Staunch Crewmate 4.1%, this is the biggest potential increase in your win rate, particularly as budget players. If you're able to secure some of this early with your uncommon picks and then build a deck that works well with these, you're going to have some much better win rates than we're looking at with average. And the average on this limited environment is higher than what we have seen in recent sets. So there are definitely high impact cards, and these blue uncommons represent some of the most impactful cards you can get outside of black that we talked about earlier. White is also bringing up some good options for those early uncommon picks with cards like a Spring-Loaded Saw Blades with a differential of 5.1, Clay-Fired Bricks sporting 4.5, and just behind it, Ruin Lurker Bat with a differential of 4.3. All of these allow you to pivot into some of those secondary white decks and still have a lot of potential power in your deck. I will also say at this point, there are definitely some uncommons out there that I'm not talking about because they only really work in the Caves deck, and we talked about Caves not being a strong enough option, so there are some things I have selectively skipped over here. Now, bringing up the rear of this conversation, because, well, somebody has to be last, is the green uncommons. And a lot of this really is warped around the red-green dinosaur deck. Picks like the reprint Thrashing Brontodon, Earthshaker Dreadmaw, or Colossal Dactyl will really have the most impact in that Gruul dinosaur deck. But of course, things like Cenote Scout works very nicely in the Merfolk deck, as does Jade Seedstone. That also works with some of the others in the green-white deck. So obviously less power, but more focus in green. So when this all comes together, when you're able to luck into some nice early rare picks, you're able to strategically select some uncommons with a plan, and then just pick up a few playable commons, you should be able to set yourself up for even more wins in this limited environment than perhaps you're used to in some of the other more recent environments. All while gathering more resources and more playable deck options for your overall arena constructed experience. And before we go, the Stronghold would like to take just a moment to thank our very supportive patron community, as well as recognize the newcomers Martin and Nick, who have decided not to miss out on a thing by capitalizing on Patreon's free content offerings. And of course, supporting the community by liking, commenting, subscribing, or sharing our videos is always appreciated. And you will appreciate subbing to the channel so you never miss out on a thing. And of course, we have some suggestions here on the next videos that you're going to want to check out.